Chapter 9, the final chapter of Tractate Arachin, covers the laws of sale and the redemption of houses and property. The first Mishnah says, a man has the right to buy back his own ancestral field, as it can never be permanently sold, and it always reverts back to its owner by the Jubilee year, which is every 50 years. If somebody sells his ancestral field when the laws of the Jubilee year exist, he can't redeem it less than 2 years after the sale, as the sale was to grant the man usage of the crops for that minimum period of 2 years. If it was a year of harsh weather, or it was a sabbatical year, so the buyer has no crops, that year doesn't count in the 2-year minimum. If the buyer plowed his field or left it fallow for a year, it's his own fault, and that counts as one of his years of use. Rabbi Eliezer says, if the owner sold him his rights to the field right before Rosh Hashanah, and the field was full of produce, the buyer just gets 3 crops from the field in 2 years. The Gemara says, not just that a man cannot redeem his field 2 years after the sale, he and the buyer are both not even permitted to do so if they want to. If somebody sells his field during the actual Jubilee year, it's a dispute. Some say it's sold, but as it's the Jubilee year, the buyer just immediately loses the field. Others say the sale doesn't take place at all. It debates between these logics, as some compare it to selling one's daughter as a maidservant after she's in a stage where the father no longer has the rights to do this, as the former opinion says the two are not comparable, as a daughter cannot be resold, but a field can. It additionally disputes between these two opinions. We mentioned that if the buyer leaves the field fallow, and also if he plows it for a year, those still count towards his minimum 2 years he gets to use the field for. Mentioning plowing the field is necessary, as it shows that the selling owner can't just pay the buyer for plowing the field and reacquire it. If somebody sold a full field right before Rosh Hashanah, the man will end up with 3 crops. He's not responsible to leave a full crop for the owner when he returns it, as based on a verse, sometimes people will eat 3 crops in a single year. New Mishnah, if the original owner of an ancestral field sold it to a buyer for 100 coins, and the buyer sold it to a second buyer for 200 coins, the original owner calculates the redemption fee according to the first sale only. If the ancestral owner sold the field for 200 coins, and the buyer sold it to a second buyer for 100 coins, the owner calculates the redemption fee according to the second buyer, as it could be calculated according to the man who currently has the field. It's impermissible to sell a distant field and use the proceeds to redeem a nearby one, and the proceeds from a poor quality field cannot redeem a high quality one, and somebody can't borrow money to redeem his field, and somebody can't redeem a field in halves. All of these would be permissible by a consecrated field, which is how there's a stringency of private property over temple property. The Gemara says that the redemption calculation always goes by the lowest price paid by any buyer. Another opinion says the same, but actually calculates it either from the original price or the current value of the land, whichever is lower. There's a practical difference where the field went up in value and then dropped and then went back up again. Our Mishnah would say the redemption would be at 100 coins, while this opinion would say it goes by 200 coins. This is as all these laws are derived from some principles of a Hebrew slave, where there's always leniencies, so to here. It additionally sources these. Essentially, as selling oneself as a slave is a transgression of Torah law, nevertheless they have leniencies apply, which it discusses some verses on. When it said a distant field cannot be sold to have a near one redeemed, or a poor quality one cannot be sold to have a better one redeemed, etc., all of those listed points and the fact that all of those are permitted by a consecrated field, that's sourced at length. It actually does bring up a disputing opinion, which holds that a consecrated field cannot be redeemed by halves. New Mishnah. If somebody sells a house that's from a walled city, referring to cities that were walled since the time of Joshua, they can be redeemed at any time throughout the 12 months after the sale. It's similar to a prohibited interest payment, but it's not actual interest. If the seller dies, his son can redeem the house. If the buyer dies, the seller redeems the house from a buyer's son. The year is counted from the date of sale, not from the calendar year, which it sources, and also that if it's a leap year, it would include the 13th added month. Others disagree and say the redemption rights stand for just 365 days of the solar calendar. If this period ends and the house isn't redeemed, it's permanently acquired by the buyer. These laws apply whether the house is sold or gifted. The Gemara says there's other opinions that dispute the source for this, although they both say that it lasts for a year and the redemption must wait at least 2 days after the sale. They just dispute where they source it from. We said this is similar to interest, although it's not actually interest. And others disagree and say it is actual interest. It's just permitted uniquely here, as they hold that interest contingent on just one side of a transaction is prohibited normally, while our Mishnah's opinion would allow that. Alternatively, they agree that such a thing would be impermissible, and what they dispute is whether interest given with intent to return it is allowed. Our Mishnah says yes, this opinion says no. It sources the necessity for the remaining listed points and further disputes how the year calculation is made, and it brings some particular cases on these laws. It said if somebody consecrates a house from a walled city, it can be redeemed at once and can be redeemed forever. If somebody else redeems it, if a full year passes without the original owner redeeming it back, it would transfer fully to the buyer. This is sourced, and it proves that if the house is sold and in the middle of the year of redemption a Jubilee year starts, it doesn't leave by the Jubilee year. New Mishnah. Originally, the strategy people used after buying a house in a walled city would be to hide on the last day of the redemption year, so that way the purchaser wouldn't be able to claim his house back. So to prevent this, it was instituted that the original owner could just forcibly enter his own house, place down the money, and redeem his property back, and the buyer could just pick up his money whenever. The Gemara says the fact that this had to be instituted implies that if a man gives his wife a divorce document on condition that she gives him 200 coins, and she gives him the money against his consent, the divorce would be invalid. This is as we typically hold giving somebody something against their consent is not allowed, and was uniquely allowed by the house repossession. Others disagree and say perhaps this institution was made by the house purchase, as the money is being deposited outside the giver's presence, unlike with the divorce document. And there's another version of this whole discussion, essentially saying that this case is where we know that even if a woman gave money to her husband for a divorce, even without his consent, it's still a valid divorce, as the institution by a house repossession was only necessary for when this was done outside of the buyer's presence. And then again, others would disagree, saying there wouldn't be a difference as to who was present, and just saying that this institution was made as a historical occurrence that's being mentioned. New Mishnah. Anything that's within the walls of such a city is treated like a house from a walled city, and all of the relevant laws accordingly apply. Rabbi Meir would even include the field within the city. If there's a house built into the city wall, it's a dispute as to what the status is. The Gemara cites sources for each of these individually, and it also mentions that there's a debate as to whether a pebble ground or a sand field is treated with the same status as a house or a field, and whether it would then be permitted. New Mishnah. A city wherein the outermost houses are packed tightly enough that they form effectively a wall, or a city that was not surrounded by a wall in the times of Joshua, those are not considered to be a walled city by these laws. A walled city would only be one with at least a plot with 3 courtyards and 2 houses each, and with a wall that exists from the days of Joshua, as mentioned. Such cities would be ones listed like Old Katra, Gedod, Jerusalem, and many others. The Gemara sources all of these. It lists many specific such walled cities, and some say that those are actually just the furthest ones. We said Jerusalem was a walled city, but it said a house there cannot be permanently sold within, so apparently it's not. So either that's just an exception uniquely, or it just refers to some other city that happens to also be named Jerusalem. The reason the specific cities in our Mishnah were uniquely listed is after the Babylonian exile, they possibly re-sanctified those specifically, although some take issue with the concept that the sanctification ended after the destruction of the first temple, and others just say that they found these select cities and enumerated them, which is why these are being listed. It additionally disputes as to whether the sanctification status left after the destruction of the first temple, and that's relevant as to when the laws of the Jubilee year were annulled. New Mishnah. By houses in open, unwalled towns, they have the special rights of houses of walled cities, and also the rights of ancestral fields, so they can be redeemed immediately and for 12 months, and they're returned by the Jubilee year or through refunding. The Gemara sources these principles at length. It explains, in this case, if an open town's house was consecrated to the temple treasury and another man redeemed it, and the Jubilee year came, it would still go back to its original owner. If the temple still had it, it would not automatically return to its owner, so people don't just say property can be unconsecrated without redemption, which is sourced. Although others disagree with the first point, and they say if a second person redeems a house of an open town from the temple treasury, he gets to keep it, and they dispute verses, although it quotes a source which says, like the first opinion, that he would still need to return it by the Jubilee year. New Mishnah. The houses of open towns have 2 courtyards with 2 houses each, and even if they have walls since Joshua, they're treated like open towns. The Gemara sources this, and the minimum amount of courtyards and houses. New Mishnah. If a Yisrael inherited a house in a walled city from his mother's father who's a Levi, he can redeem it like a Levi. Or if a Levi inherited such a house from his mother's father who's a Yisrael, he needs to redeem it like a Yisrael, as the seller needs to be a Levi, and the house must be of the cities of the Levium, from a Levitical city. Others disagree and say, while this all only applies by the cities of Levium, the seller does not actually need himself to be a Levi. The Gemara clarifies, according to the first opinion, the Yisrael man can only redeem the house like a Yisrael and not like a Levi. It sources his opinion that he can only redeem it like a Levi if it's a Levitical city and he himself is a Levi. The final opinion disagrees with this, and he says this can be done by a Levi or a Yisrael. New Mishnah. In a Levitical city, a field cannot be made into a clearing cannot be made into a field or a city, and a city cannot be made into a clearing. Some say by Yisrael cities, most of these would be allowed, but a city cannot be made into a clearing, as otherwise the cities will just end up being destroyed. Kohanim and Levium can sell and redeem whenever they want, based on a verse. The Gemara agrees. A change cannot be made in a Levitical city specifically. We said Kohanim and Levium can sell and redeem whenever they want. It quotes a discussion about Levium selling houses in walled cities, which is difficult as none of the Levitical cities could be walled, so it said that it was permitted for them to have a city and then to wall it later on, but then it says such a city wouldn't have the status of a walled city, so it answers perhaps the Levi won the house in a lottery, and it's saying that even though he needs to now sell such a house, that Levi is able to redeem it then if he wants to. It quotes some additional sources, one of which compares a Kohen's cherem vowed field to an ancestral field, and it explains this is done to show that a Kohen can permanently redeem his own ancestral field, but he cannot redeem his cherem field after the Jubilee year passes. And that's the end of chapter 9, and the entire Tractate Arachin.